Hello and welcome to the 8-Man Nightmare Mode, the Terror from Beyond boss fight guide. My name's Hayete, and today I'll be covering everything you need to know to successfully complete the last fight in the Terror from Beyond operation. For this encounter, we suggest you bring a standard composition of 2 tanks, 4 DPS, and 2 healers. Any class composition will be more than capable of beating this fight. In this guide, I'll only be covering the Nightmare-specific mechanics and strategies. If you need the foundational mechanics and strategies, please take a moment and check out our hard mode guide before continuing. That will get you up to speed on everything you need to know prior to watching this guide. Alright, so let's talk DPS requirements. The DPS required for both Phase 1 and Phase 2 of this encounter are extremely high, and will require the full effort of your entire raid team to properly handle. Both phases analysis have been calculated similar to the hard mode versions. Here is the analysis for Phase 1. Note that this shows an analysis based on 1 tentacle pair, and not the total 3 pairs you'll face during the fight. The enrage for each pair is 1 minute and 15 seconds. However, you lose roughly 3 seconds while waiting for the tentacles to spawn. With that in mind, the time to kill has been adjusted down to 72 seconds. The adjusted DPS total was based on 2000 DPS per tank. As you can see, the DPS needed here is very high. Furthermore, this analysis does not take into account healer DPS put onto each tentacle, nor does it account for the second set of adds that will spawn at the end of each tentacle pair. Phase 2 is a bit more straightforward, as the enrage time here is the exact same as in hard mode. Thus, the DPS analysis is more or less identical to the hard mode analysis. Although the minimum DPS required here does not seem like much, it is indeed quite high when levied against the other mechanics you're dealing with throughout Phase 2. With that said, there is no adjusted DPS total here, because more or less the DPS done by the tanks is a difficult variable to factor in, as almost all DPS done by your tanks will be to the boss itself, and the total DPS contributed by your tanks to other enemies can vary greatly from pool to pool. As with Phase 1, this analysis again does not factor in healer DPS. Okay, so let's discuss the mechanic differences new to Nightmare. Number 1. Unstable Larva. All mechanics inherent to these adds are still the same as in hard mode. However, in Nightmare these adds move much faster. Furthermore, these adds can no longer be mitigated if allowed to detonate on their targeted player. If these adds come within 4 meters of their aggro target, that player and any other player within 4 meters will die instantly. Number 2. Void Disturbance. New to Nightmare, Void Disturbance now acts as a stacking buff when acquired. Each stack gained will increase the amount of damage done to nearby targets, and will also do increased damage to the player that has the buff. Furthermore, immediately on the 5th stack of the buff, the player maintaining the buff will die instantly. Number 3. Birthed Larva. Similar to Unstable Larva, the Birthed Larva in Nightmare will instantly kill any player that aggroes one. Number 4. Tunneling Tentacles buff. This mechanic acts exactly as it did in hard mode. However, in Nightmare, the boss now maintains 6 buffs instead of 8. Number 5. Hypergate Inconsistency. This is a brand new mechanic for Nightmare mode. This orb spawns at 50% health on any tentacle in Phase 2. The mechanic, once spawned, will tether itself to the player closest to the home platform and will apply a debuff reducing all healing received. Okay. Now that you're caught up on the mechanic changes for Nightmare, let's discuss how to actually beat this encounter. So there are actually quite a few ways to go about defeating this boss. The strategy used and explained in the hard mode guide can still be used in Nightmare, but requires an impressive amount of skill and efficiency from your DPS. The strategy I'm going to cover will be aimed at those groups that may not have this level of DPS, and thus would be unable to utilize the standard hard mode strategy. So with that said, let me walk you through each part of this fight and explain our suggested way of dealing with each part of it. Before you begin the fight, you'll want to split your group into 2 groups, the same as you would for hard mode. However, we highly suggest pairing your highest DPSing tank healer, and top 2 DPS on the same tentacle. The idea here is to push one tentacle down under 10% so that these DPS can then swap and focus down the second. This at face value would seem to accomplish nothing. Here shortly, I'm going to explain why this matters and it's a good idea. As you initiate the fight, we suggest having any gunslingers or snipers in your group immediately drop flyby or orbital strike in such a way that both tentacles are hit by it. You'll then start the fight the same as you would in hard mode. As the hypergate beacon spawns, ensure it is killed ASAP. Depending on your group, you can have 1 or 2 DPS kill this ad. We highly suggest though having 2 DPS, preferably ranged, kill it ASAP. Unlike in the hard mode guide, we highly suggest using the void disturbances in Nightmare. There are 2 ways those can be employed. The buff can be used against unstable larva or against the tentacle. We suggest using the buff against a tentacle and having a DPS, preferably melee, use it. This is where the earlier mentioned DPS offsetting comes into place. There are 2 scenarios that take place when coupling the DPS offsetting and the void disturbance. Case number 1 is that the strong DPS side gets the void disturbance and is able to push their tentacle down extremely fast. At around 11% to 12%, you'll have the DPS swap to the other tentacle and leave the tank and healer to push the last bit below 10%. You'll then have all DPS available to push the other tentacle to dead. Case 2 is that the weak side DPS gets the void disturbance. This generally evens out the DPS on both sides. In this case, you can either just have each group push their tentacle individually below 10%, or have the first group to reach 10% swap to the other and help push the second tentacle to dead. In either case, your goal here is to have the tentacles dead before they enrage. Towards the end of each tentacle pair, a second set of unstable larva ads will spawn. Simply ignore these ads and finish off the tentacles. Immediately after both tentacles are gone, have all DPS and healers start DPSing the ads. Birth larva ads will spawn just as in hard mode, and you'll need to avoid these. You'll rinse and repeat this process 3 times. Okay, now let me give you some specific tips for Phase 1. For Phase 1, it is very important that both your tanks and your healers do as much DPS as they possibly can to offset the DPS check and the tight enrage time. If, however, you're going to hit enrage on any tentacle pair, your tanks and healers need to prepare for this before it happens. Healers should immediately start working on tanks when the second set of unstable larvae spawn, and do what they can to keep the tanks at 100% health. As soon as the tentacles enrage, healers should start overhealing and spam casting their highest healing abilities. Sages and sorcerers should also keep force armor applied as well. Tanks should begin to prep for high damage, and when tentacles enrage, use defensive cooldowns and adrenals as necessary. Enraged tentacles, unmitigated, can hit for upwards of 75,000 damage. My point here is if you're going to hit enrage, prepare for it ahead of time. Guardian and Juggernaut tanks and DPS can use Saber Reflect to both reflect unenraged and enraged slams back at the tentacle. Keep this in mind when considering each side's composition. Tanks kiting unstable larvae is another big point to note for Phase 1, so let me show you some ways to handle this. There are generally 2 ways to kite these ads that worked for us well: waterside and inside swap. Let's say the ads spawn in this location and travel along this path to the tanks. The easiest way to respond to this is to have your tanks move to this location and then back to the tentacle. This is what we call waterside. If the ads, however, spawn in a location like this, for example, and move along this path, then the tank would want to kite into this direction, what we call an inside swap. With this method, however, your tank needs to communicate to their side's group prior to moving around, so the DPS and the healer can essentially swap around behind the tentacle as to avoid getting slammed. Throughout each tentacle pair, healers and tanks should do as much DPS to ads, hypergate beacons, etc. as possible while still properly managing their own roles. The Void Disturbance buff does quite a lot of damage, so the DPS player using it should utilize some kind of defensive cooldown while it is active, and the healer should be sure to keep them above 50% HP at all times, as stacks 3 and 4 can do quite a lot of damage. Regardless, ensure that this buff is cleansed at 4 stacks, because if it reaches 5, the player with the buff will die instantly. During the second tentacle pair, the Void Disturbance will spawn in the middle of the area. Melee classes are by far the best to handle this, as melee classes have abilities that will aid them in getting quickly to the orbs, and then back to their tentacle. My last piece of advice for Phase 1 is to stagger your raid buffs and adrenal use. Since you have 3 equally difficult enrage times to push, using buffs and adrenals wisely will go a long way in helping you defeat Phase 1. We suggest using 1 raid buff, preferably a healer's, on Tentacle Pair 1, adrenals on Pair 2, and all remaining raid buffs available on Pair 3. This obviously will be dependent on your group composition as to what is available to you. Okay, let's discuss Phase 2. Phase 2 is played almost exactly like hard mode with some minor differences. Let's walk through each of the 3 tentacle pairs, and I'll explain what everyone should be doing here, then I'll give you some general tips. More or less, the idea here is the same as in hard mode. Kill the tentacles, kill the anomalies, kill irregularities, and the new mechanic inconsistency. Do this 3 times, spread out for Furious Tantrum, and kill the boss. That all has gone unchanged. However, the way to accomplish all of this is now much more demanding and requires a lot more pre-planning. So during the first tentacle pair, as you enter Phase 2, you'll want to send all DPS down to Platform 10. Tanks should split and head to Platforms 12 and 13. Leave 1 healer at home and send the other healer with the DPS group at Platform 10. The Acid Spit mechanic in Nightmare is a huge problem, and does a considerably large amount of damage to anyone standing in it. In Nightmare, this will 2 or 3 shot a player unmitigated. This means your tanks need to manage this mechanic and where it drops. The Terror itself will do 8 slams to the tank currently aggroed to him. Immediately after this, he will spit on the tank's platform. He'll then scream and repeat. What the tanks need to do is drop down to platforms 14 and 16 on the 7th slam, drop spit after the 8th slam, and then move back up to platforms 12 and 13. This keeps spit off the outer platforms so that the player chasing anomalies is not impeded. DPS and the 1 healer with them should start on platform 9. Due to the tight enrage time, you'll want to get as much DPS in on the tentacles as possible. This means having DPS take slams while using defensive cooldowns to increase DPS uptime on the tentacles. Here is a list that we've compiled of various combinations that we know work in mitigating slam damage, enough to be a viable option for remaining on the platform. Unmitigated, a tentacle slam will one-shot a player, even a tank. The healer with the DPS is there to burst heal the DPS so that they are at full health to take slams when needed, as well as aid in adding some additional DPS in between healing. We suggest having the healer on the home platform focus heals on the tanks and the player attacking anomalies, and the other healer with the group take care of everyone else. The DPS chasing anomalies should take care of them the same as in hard mode. However, this player should do their best to return to the tentacle for any damage they can put on it in between anomalies. Tanks, when not the active target of the terror, should also put as many attacks as possible on the tentacles to aid in DPS. The healer at home will gain the inconsistency debuff at 50% on each tentacle. The inconsistency will always be located on platform 7. The healer with this debuff should run to platform 7 as soon as possible to destroy the inconsistency. Unlike other adds in this encounter, as soon as you reach the inconsistency, it will die. You will not need to DPS it down. Once tentacles go down, the irregularities will spawn, and this can be handled exactly the same as in hard mode. Different from hard mode and Nightmare, however, is that anomalies will not disappear as this phase starts. This means every anomaly must be killed. As you push into the second tentacle pair, you'll need to reposition your group. Tanks should take up the same platforms as before, 12 and 13, and as the 7th slam happens, the currently aggroed tank should jump to either 9 or 11 respectively. Wait for the spit to drop, and then move to platform 10. The tank on 10 will then receive Scream there. The reason for doing this is that it puts the tank as close to the home platform as possible without impeding the outer platforms where the anomalies will be spawning. Since Screams and Nightmare must be run back to home to remove the debuff, this makes it incredibly efficient. DPS and the healer with them in this phase will start on platform 15 and start on the tentacle on 14. You'll basically rinse and repeat the same mechanics and strategies for dealing with these tentacles, anomalies, inconsistencies, and irregularities as was done with the first pair. The third and final pair of tentacles is an exact mirror copy of the first pair, and should be handled the exact same. Alright, so a few tips for Phase 2. Tanks should always aim to maximize downtime on the boss by either attacking tentacles or attacking anomalies. Focusing the boss and communicating when spit is going out is a good way to always know when you're about to have to retake the boss. Otherwise, you should always be DPSing something. The healer on home should focus the boss as well. As soon as Scream starts to channel, try and line up your biggest heal to connect with the targeted player immediately after the Scream channel is finished. This will allow you to almost immediately burst the tank back up to full and is a very proactive way of healing for this encounter. While DPSing tentacles, any damage over time abilities applied and spread through dot spreading abilities will be applied to the terror as well. If the terror reaches 14% health or less, it will immediately trigger the Furious Tantrum mechanic. Any tunneling tentacle buffs remaining at that time Furious Tantrum starts will cause the terror to heal for 20% of its total health per stack remaining. This means that the DPS and tank should be very careful and cognizant of the boss's health, as to not push the boss beyond 15% HP before the last tentacle in the third pair is defeated. Adrenals will always be available for DPS every tentacle pair, so be sure to use them every time they're up. Raid buffs can also be staggered similar to Phase 1 and should be used on each tentacle pair. Ensure, however, that those using raid buffs are close enough to affect the DPS. For example, a raid buff used on home will not reach DPS on platforms behind the boss. Use these raid buffs wisely, and they'll go a long way in helping you beat the Titan Rage for this phase. To better help groups coordinate in conjunction with our guide strategies, all strategy mapping diagrams will be linked in the description section below. So that's the fight, guys. The things I see messed up more than anything else in this entire encounter are the ads in Phase 1. Do not let an unstable or birth larva touch you. If you can do that, and as a group your DPS is high enough to beat or be right at the enrage, you'll have little issue with this fight. So if you like this video, the best way you can help show your support is to hit the like button and subscribe. It definitely helps us out, guys, and keeps us motivated to continue making these guides. If this video helped you defeat this boss, please share your success with us in the comment section below. Also, if you want to stay connected and be the first to know of updates and streams associated with the guides or with Phalanx Squad in general, follow us on Twitch and Twitter. Both links are in the description below. Thanks for watching, guys, and until next time, enjoy the fight.